Thank you so much for waiting. Welcome to the Gardner Center for Asian Art and Ideas. My name is Haley. I'm the Public Engagement Manager at the Seattle Art Museum, and thank you so much for joining us today. It is great to see you all here in person on this lovely day, and I think you all made a right choice to be here. Before we begin, I'd like to say that Seattle Art Museum respectfully acknowledges that we are on indigenous land, the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people. We honor our ongoing connection to these communities, past, present, and future. Again, thank you for joining our 2022 Saturday University Lecture Series, Architecture of Asia, Sacred Spaces, and Cultural Landscapes. The series is a constellation of various themes surrounding sacred sites, architectural practices across Asia, and we will explore different forms of architecture in cities, ecological landscapes, reflect on sacred spaces from distant locations around Asia, and consider what it means to behold sacred space in our present moment, dominated by a constant influx and changing climates. Today, we have the pleasure to hear from our Director and Associate Professor of Cornell University, Sean Anderson. Sean will deliver a talk titled, We Lead Ourselves, Cold War Alignment and Modern Architecture in South Asia. He will explore the influence of South Asian architecture after Cold War and the cultural landscape of the non-aligned movement that brought to fore decolonizing efforts through architecture and urbanism among newly independent nations of India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka during the mid-20th century. Before we hear from Sean, I want to take a moment to thank our longstanding partner, the Jackson School of International Studies at University of Washington. A special thanks goes to them for their support since the Saturday University lecture first began back in 2009. Also, thanks to our Dr. Mimi Gardner-Gates for her guidance and support, and to our trustees and museum members who allow Sam to do the work of connecting art to life. If you'd like to be a member, please visit seattleartmuseum.org. I also want to thank the SAM team to make this program happen. Our communication team, folks from security, the AV, IT, facilities, visitor experience, and countless others. We couldn't put these programs on without your collaboration. Now I just have a few logistical notes. The lecture will be recorded and made available online on SAM's YouTube channel in the coming weeks. The talk will last 50 minutes approximately, and we will have 30 minutes of Q&A and moderate discussion. If you'd like to ask questions, please write them, or we'll be passing around mic later, and my colleague Kayla will be helping you. Your participation today in this program entitles you to visit the museum after the presentation is over. Next slide, please. There's much to see in this museum, including exhibition Beyond the Mountain, contemporary Chinese artists in classical forms. Next slide, please. I also want to mention that tomorrow is the last day of Giacometti exhibition, so if you have not seen it, this is the final weekend of viewing. So please join us. And finally, our next Saturday Universal Lecture Series will take place on November 12th, titled The Shape of Water. Next slide, please. The Built Environment in Ganges River and North Bihar. Dr. Luisa Cortesi will speak about her research as well as her lived experience in communities around the river through the several disastrous floods. Now on to today's presentation. Sean Anderson is an architect, scholar, and current director and associate professor at the College of Architecture, Art, and Planning at Cornell University. Sean was a longtime curator, widely recognized for timely and provocative exhibitions of architecture and design at the Museum of Modern Art, including the highly acclaimed exhibition, Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America, the first MoMA exhibit to highlight the works of African American and African diasporic architects. He also organized the exhibitions Insecurities, Tracing Displacement and Shelter, Thinking Machines, Art and Design in the Computer Age, 1959 till 1989, and 4 iterations of Young Architects. Sorry, my pages are, let's see. And MoMA PS1. Sorry. In 2020, Sean co-curated on Muzarel Islam, Surfacing Intention at Dark Art Summit in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And he will return there for 2023 Dark Art Summit, Bana, with exhibition to Enter the Sky. Sean has practiced as an architect and taught in Afghanistan, Australia, India, Italy, Morocco, Sri Lanka, and United Arab Emirates. After his presentation, Sean will join on stage for a conversation and Q&A by Dr. Vikram Prakash, an architect, architectural historian, and theorist who is a professor of architecture at the University of Washington with adjunct appointment in landscape architecture, urban design and planning, and digital arts and experimental media. Dr. Vikram received his bachelor's in architecture from Chandigarh College of Architecture, Punjab University, India, and his MA and P.h.D. in History of Architecture and Urbanism from Cornell University, Ithaca, New York. He's the author of a number of books on issues of modernism, post-coloniality, global history, and fashion and architecture. Lastly, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our special guests today, the students of University of Washington joining us this morning. Welcome. Now, please join me in welcoming Sean to the stage.
I promised Haley that I would scale the stage rather than go through the back. Thank you very, very much for that generous introduction. Thank you to the Seattle Asian Art Museum. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, to have received an invitation to join all of you today. And I have to congratulate all of you for coming to the museum at 10 o'clock in the morning to hear a lecture about the Cold War. Congratulations, you've done it. And so I will hope that, that my talk today, with a few good images here and there and discussions of far-off places that are very close to my heart and to Vikram's heart and perhaps to our students here from the University of Washington, we can engage in a very nice conversation that is not only, I think, reflective of a lot of the questions that institutions like this one and universities across the country and world are dealing with, but also the notion that, that when we discuss and think about what Asia or multiple Asias might be, we think of the ways in which geography doesn't necessarily anymore encompass how we understand and think about and reflect on architecture in particular. So I wanted to just say another great thanks to Haley, who has been an extraordinary help and very patient with me, with my crazy schedule, and also to Kayla and to our AV people who resolved technical issues this morning, and of course to our interpreters here. And I will try to speak slowly to help things along, as it were. So with that, I'm going to present a talk today that comes from a much longer essay. It was written for a book, and then it was taken out of a book, and I've reworked it for this morning. And it comes out of years of not only research, but more, I think more importantly, personal experience in South Asia, which Vikram and I can talk about a little bit, in that I practiced, my first job as an architect was in India, and it is a place, a country, and a nation, and a region that I have very close ties with. It's also, in a sense, my other home, both intellectually and kind of emotionally, if you will. And so this work comes out of research that I began also as part of an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, but I think more importantly reflects ideas that I have been thinking about and responding to in other research and work, especially on and around the African continent as well. So with that, I'm going to, and the clicker works, which is great. I am going to begin. And also, just one note. I don't like reading generally, so I will read my text, but often respond to images outside of my text. But for now, I'm just going to read. Accompanied by the ambiguous terms set out by prevailing arguments for, quote, building a new India, espoused by the first prime minister of that country, Jawaharlal Nehru, the creation of a Muslim, quote, Pakistan, expressed by its first Governor General, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, or the first denomination of a new nation called Sri Lanka in 1972. The reshaping of a modern South Asia was amplified through an architecture of transnational flows. Emerging from centuries of colonialism with new border regimes, infrastructures, and access to untapped industries, many politicians throughout the region, as well as architects, sought to diminish ideological fissures through redefining strategic alliances that bypassed growing discordance between post-war United States and Russia and their inherent political ideologies. Decrying forms of colonization among newly independent nations at the 1955 Africa-Asia Conference held in Bandung, Indonesia, Ceylon, which would become Sri Lanka in 1972, Ceylon's Prime Minister, Sir John Kotalawala, indicated, quote, "If we are united in our opposition to colonialism, should it not be our duty to openly declare our opposition to Soviet colonialism as much as to Western colonialism," end quote. Think about that in reference to today's events that are happening throughout Europe. And here I pause for a moment with a quote from the opening speech of that conference, but also the presence of African-American novelist Richard Wright, who on a French journalist visa was invited to respond to the events, the meetings, the conversations that were happening at the Bandung Conference, and one in which he felt very much was reflective of a change and a transformation in the ways in which the world was being organized. And it was here at the Bandung Conference that the notion of a third world would start to emerge. Architecture and urbanism consequently became mediums for embodying decolonizing efforts among the independent nations of India, East Pakistan, which would become Bangladesh, and West Pakistan, which would become Pakistan, and Ceylon. Transnational relationships, including those with the West, were subscribed to at multiple scales, while broader political policies, including those maintained by socialist governments, diminished the prospects of architects to maintain such allegiance. Formulated in 1947 and further defined at Bandung's, quote, colonial conference that I just described, the evolution of the non-aligned movement as an alternative or, quote, middle way was conceived as a transnational linking of cooperative buffers toward ameliorating or at least responding to Cold War partisanship throughout the world, economic sanctions, and defensive postures. Similarly, the 1950 to 1951 Colombo Plan for Cooperative Economic and Social Development in Asia and the Pacific was conceived as an intergovernmental organization that, through South-South cooperation, furthered mutual aid and self-help through the expansion of skills development, transfers of technology, and actual capital, physical capital. Architects, engineers, and planners countered then in these countries an imperial past with a renewed interest in locating settlement patterns, building vernaculars, and forms of urbanization as potential crossings for newfound networks and forces of modernization. Processes of decolonization then relied upon a political and socioeconomic scaffold found among these formal networks, so those founded within the non-aligned movement that were emerging in the Bandung Conference, and here, as you see, in the Colombo Plan from 1951. These networks were a metaphor to further recognize that structural change throughout society inflected new spatial and aesthetic orders that could then be imprinted upon the making of architecture. So my talk this morning is thus organized around 4 nations that I've described and observes the ways in which geopolitical alignments affected the making and reception of urban institutions and their imaginaries. So I will start with India and non-aligned nationalism. Numerous practitioners, including architects, engineers, and artists, sought to inculcate radical meanings for a built environment that transgressed historical connotations with post-colonial reckoning. For India, this period offers new perspectives on the relations between external forces shaping the built environment and that of local or regional grounding of ideas about what it meant to be a newly independent nation. Historical forms are the basis for an imaging of contemporaneous anti-colonial struggles and claims to self-rule. Habib Rahman Gandhi Ghat, the first design commission, a young architect that you see in the middle top of the screen, he received in 1949, shortly after Mahatma Gandhi's assassination, reductively emulates the shikara form common to Bengali and Orissar temple structures, Hindu temple structures. And the top of this structure is capped with a minaret's metal plating, while a thin shell cantilever arched roof out of concrete serves as both a visual threshold and shelter for visitors prior to descending the steps or the ghat that lead to the Hooghly River. And so Habib Rahman is this very enigmatic figure. He's working for the Public Works Department in India, based in Bengal, and eventually moves to Delhi. And so this is still present, very much present, and you can see Nehru being very much wanted to be associated with a figure like this, not only as the architect, but also as a building form. And for Nehru, this became a kind of model for what he was imagining to be a modernism in India. In March 1959, a group of architects and policymakers gathered at the Lalit Kala Academy in Delhi to debate the direction for architecture representative of their independent country. 12 years following the dismantling of the British Raj, and with Nehru's penchant for building that expressed, if not symbolized, a break from India's ancient and colonial past, the group's debate shifted toward a modern style, rather than turning toward a revival of historical influences. Such discussions were indicative of broader schemes, including those by Nehru, to rewrite a modern Indian history that formulated a new national identity and its position on the international front. Ideals sought in part to bring together ideas around an Indianness, a broad scheme for Indianness that connoted unity through diversity as well as religious tolerance. And so on your right is the minutes, if you will, from that seminar. And on the left is another Rahman memorial, this time in Delhi, right across from the Jama Masjid, the main mosque of Old Delhi. And for Nehru, these forms, these very reductive forms that spoke to a long history but recast in a new way, symbolize very much what Nehru thought of as a modern architecture. That the Academy building, the Lalit Kala Academy building, with its sinuous profile, aggregate stone and tile facades, and slender continuous horizontal windows, also designed by Habib Rahman in 1954, had been a center for contemporary art exhibitions and lectures debating what constituted the modern. And this was not lost on those participating in the seminar on architecture. Architects, engineers, policymakers, foreign specialists in development, including those of American Albert Meyer, were in attendance and accompanied an exhibition of both local and foreign projects. And Albert Meyer, you see on the bottom of the screen, was working at the time for a kind of nascent Ford Foundation. And he was building model villages in Uttar Pradesh. The seminar focused on the interactions of architecture, climate, technology, visual arts, and rural indigenous forms as interconnected expressions of nationalist philosophy. Architecture in India, as conceived in this interdisciplinary manner, was thought to eschew the fragmentation brought upon by colonialism and even the appropriation of historic forms as a means to address contemporary problems. Although proposed plans to incorporate more visible elements of India's ancient past into new buildings, such as that of Habib Rahman, these ideas were discussed. Prominent architects such as Delhi-based Akyut Konvinde advocated for alternative approaches. Using terms such as the words democratic and universal, the architect proposed a more modern sensibility for new institutions in the country, eventually winning over Nehru, who had previously desired a dominant kind of revivalist message. The 1959 seminar marks then a crucial juncture at which the transmission and translation of a modern architecture in India, and perhaps for the region as a whole, are situated. As scholar Rebecca Brown has noted, this, quote, moment within the formation of national policy induces a fissure in the dominant historical narrative of the march toward modernist architecture, end quote. In 1958, plans for a new kind of institution in Delhi came to signify the broader ambitions of a growing cultural elite and its intersections with foreign philanthropy. Conceived by John D. Rockefeller during his first trip to India, plans for an international center were broached with Nehru's vice president of the time, Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan. Having approached the Rockefeller Foundation to propose what he conceived as a cultural center or, quote, international house for India, plans for the site were established in concert with an American expatriate architect, Joseph Allen Stein, who ultimately was commissioned to design the complex. With funding by the Rockefeller Foundation and a nondescript site adjacent to the Mughal-era Lodi Gardens and surrounded by forest, Radhakrishnan proclaimed, quote, the days of cultural tribalism are over. We no more have separate cultural universes. East and West have come together, never to part again, and they must settle down in some kind of peaceful coexistence, which will eventually grow into active, friendly cooperation. That is essential for the future of the world, the welfare of the world itself. Wise words we should learn and maintain. Dedicated by Crown Prince Akihito of Japan in 1960, completed in 1962, the center, the Indian International Center that we see on the screen now, was to become a locus for policy debates, aesthetic research, social interactions, to ensure the continuities of what might constitute a new multinational India. Finding aesthetic kinship as he continued to work on the design of a nearby arts and cultural center, the Triveni Kala Sangam, Stein's buildings at once assert a collectivity found within the design of transparent internal and external social spaces, multiple galleries, performance areas, both of which have libraries, and so forth. Fired clay screens, or jali, some using blue tiles, contained within precast concrete frames, sheathe the administrative wings of both buildings, while concrete panels with exposed aggregate punctuate the ends of both of these buildings. Both complexes and their relationship of the interior elucidate a kind of cultivated sense of nature and its relationship to a monumental past. And it was calculated through multiple outdoor areas that were for social exchange and also views into these landscapes and water bodies. The interior finishes were sourced from throughout the world, indicating not only an indebtedness to Nehru's more open economy, but also how both the Triveni Kalasingam and the IIC became an embodiment of these cross-border trajectories. So in each case, both buildings include timber from Burma, tiles from Iran, and multiple other materials that are coming outside of India inside to the building. Now, this is in Delhi, and I want to shift just for a moment to southern India. In the southern Indian state of Kerala, indigenous typologies and materials were disregarded at independence in favor of potentially modernist abstraction. Architecture and planning of this period, at least in Kerala, was built on an understanding of language as a shared cultural construct and was presented as a continuation of self-determination. And here is the staging of when the state of Kerala became a state in 1956. And you can see, I want just you to pay attention to the building on the left, because that form will get played out in Sri Lanka. Activist and architect Laurie Baker preferred domestic and institutional designs, including those for the Center for Development Studies here on the screen in Trivandrum, and to use exposed brick that, while climatically sensitive, was also associated, visually at least, with poverty and a nostalgia for the past. British-born Baker had arrived in India in 1945 as a missionary, working as a builder with the World Leprosy Mission among Himalayan villages for 16 years before transferring to Kerala. There, he founded COSFORD, the Center of Science and Technology for Rural Development, an organization that advocated for, designed, and established low-cost housing schemes across southern India. The imbrication of aesthetics and politics in Kerala and South Asia more broadly, while prefigured by progressive movements in the arts, were also in part based on calls by Mohandas Gandhi for greater self-sufficiency. For Baker and his human-centered practice, while dependent on a recognition of materials such as brick and mud to embody an aesthetics of localized nationalism, also allowed for an architecture to be grounded within a brand of social realism, quote, for a new middle-class consciousness with values of independence and societal change. And that's Baker himself writing in his diary. And so I show you my favorite coffee house from Trivandrum. This is right across from the main train station. It is literally a spiral. One walks up the spiral, and the tables that you see there are all on steps that move down along the interior periphery of this all-brick building. It is quite an icon in Trivandrum, and it makes amazing dosas. Such claims for both an aesthetic and political solidarity persisted with the strengthening of international networks, emboldened by the exchange of services, materials, and technologies sourced from allies and described by the Colombo Plan and the potential of non-aligned countries. In 1970, the opening of one corner of the India International Center's garden attracted much attention. And just as a note, you can see that each of the non-aligned countries would have meetings, annual meetings, the Colombo Plan meetings, and often this map would be presented as a way to understand these services that were being transferred and translated across the region. Placed within a square parterre, initially designed as part of an overall landscape plan envisioned by Stein, and inscribed by quotations by Mohandas Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., serve today as beacons for those invited into the India International Center's premises. Inaugurated by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, Nehru's daughter, whose emergency from 1975 to 77 would dismantle civil protections, political equity, and economic viability throughout the nation, the Gandhi King Plaza remains today a crossing for advocates of a, quote, spiritual modernity, forged through an acknowledgement of agency in the burgeoning modern city. And so you can see here, there are the two quotes. This is King, this is Gandhi, and then they are also inscribed in Hindi on the reverse. So now I'm going to move to Pakistan briefly, and I'm call this section From Village to City. With Jinnah's overt rejection of the past as a means to accommodate a population of refugees brought on by the partition, historian Chris Moffat argues that, quote, if the new Indian state was able to draw on a language of historical continuity, Pakistan's national narrative required a disavowal. The variety of local and regional identities gathered inside new territorial boundaries made it impossible to rely on conventional markers of belonging, like blood or soil, end quote. In East and West Pakistan, the crossing of political ideologies with those of religion, language, and regional cooperation led to the founding of two political parties, the Muslim League and the Awami Muslim League, and then in both cities, so one in Karachi and one in Dhaka. These organizations galvanized a questioning of nationalisms at reach among urban centers while inciting independence movements in both nations. Further, as a response to intellectual historian Faisal Devji, one may apprehend Jinnah's, quote, frequent invocation of New World models of nationalism, his calls to forget or bury the past, and he urged his new countrymen to leave behind the history of fragmentation, dispersal, and linguistic or ethnic division that characterized the Muslim community in British India. Modern architecture thus became a locus for visualizing Pakistani sovereignty, but in whose vision? Bound with temporalities that affected Pakistan's notion of unity and independence, the convergence of international architects and local practitioners led to manifestations of modern architecture and urbanism simultaneously tied to the rural as well as informal urban vernaculars. And so here we have Doxiadis, the architect, on your left, Greek architect on the left, who would do the master plan for Baghdad, as well as many other cities throughout the world. And they're holding the initial plan for a new capital city in northern Pakistan called Islamabad. For the founder of Pakistan's nuclear program, Ali Bhutto's government, a closer relationship with the Soviets led to increased attention on sharing material technologies, including concrete. Even with a degree of self-sufficiency assured by this time and this period of sharing across nations, the country was still reliant on imports from as far as Romania, as well as India. Yasmin Lari, the first Pakistani woman to become a registered architect and dear friend, was commissioned to design the large-scale Anguri Bagh housing complex in Lahore in 1973. Settling in Karachi upon returning from studying in London, Lari had initially maintained one foot in government projects, yet throughout her career has maintained an extensive research and study of Pakistan's rural villages and towns. And so on the left, you can see one of her prototype buildings built in the desert, more or less, of Sindh province in southern Pakistan. The incremental housing project of Anguri Bagh was proposed as a way to modernize ways of living among predominantly rural inhabitants who were living on the edges of an expanding city. With its staggered terraces as well as interlocking living spaces, the ordering of individual units allowed women, in particular, to maintain vegetable gardens as well as keep animals out of public view. Undoing the top-down imposition of gendered and class-defined modernist development, Lari centered her later projects on studies of the Pakistani rural settlement and in particular earth buildings. And these included a resettlement project in 1980, which sought to provide a land-sharing, self-financing housing scheme for Karachi's largest informal settlement. And this is work that she still undertakes today, especially in light of the floods. Efficiencies found with the adoption of low-cost, locally produced materials resulted in an intention on the adoption of new industries that were eschewed and inconsistent broader government linkages to internal suppliers. Like Yasmin Lari's shift from a dominant use of concrete in her own house, which I showed a moment ago, here on the right, as well as associated government projects and in exchange for brick and mud. Sorry, I lost my place. Yes, here we are. Lahore-based Nair Ali Dada's first projects from the 1970s include the Pakistani Arts Council, or renamed the Alhambra Arts Council, which is Lahore's leading privately funded cultural organization. And they had commissioned Ali Dada to design a complex of auditoriums and gallery spaces on the site of an existing colonial bungalow that they had repurposed in 1948. Referencing the red brick found throughout the city, including the red sandstone used in the Mughal-era Lahore fort, as well as echoing that of British colonial structures, the Alhambra complex buildings are structured by angled, cast-in-place concrete walls with a veneer of locally produced red brick. For Ali Dada, Lari, as well as Doxiadis and Ekushar, responses to local vernaculars were filtered then through a confluence of historical messaging, while a burgeoning population of economically interdependent citizens sought new networks from which to assert their visibility. now to Bangladesh, and building a homeland. Nationalist tensions surfaced contemporaneous to the partition of India and Pakistan based on religion and brought further conflicts in subsequent decades between West Pakistan, West Bengal, and East Pakistan. Asymmetrical power relations between that of India and Pakistan in 1952 were complicated not only through the reconstitution of their national borders and the reconfiguration of urban spaces, but also, most importantly, by the choice of spoken languages. The statewide enforcement of religion led to disillusionment among secular West Bengali and East Pakistan intellectuals who were especially incensed with regard to their choice of language, Bangla, a language of Bangladesh, and not Urdu, the language of Pakistan and Western India. With India's shifting alignments, both West and East Pakistan became politically and economically allied first with the United States and later with China. Internally, however, differing notions of Islamic nationalism led West Pakistan governing elites to espouse a form of religious Islam that was felt to be a buffer against Hindu-majority India. On its eastern flanks, however, East Pakistan had been associated with political, intellectual, and architectural traditions informed in part by the founder of an arts institution named Shantiniketan, and it was founded by a poet and polymath, Rabindranath Tagore. Centered in creative studies of the rural and vernacular systems of inhabitation. So you see the building on the left, it's built as an evocation of a kind of Bengali vernacular architecture, as well as modernist protocols found in materialist abstraction. Shantiniketan students were embedded in critical discourses at once informed by transnational synthesis of artistic styles, but also affirming a West Bengali identity. Prompted by the Bangladesh Liberation War, the Indo-Pakistan War of 1971 involved Pakistani forces that attempted to quell dissent in East Pakistan. And in the midst of hundreds of thousands of individuals being killed and millions more becoming refugees in India and in Burma, East Pakistan became an independent Bangladesh. And I show these two images very quickly here. On the top right, this is a painting class in Shantiniketan that was informed by Bauhaus painting teachers in the 1920s who came from Weimar to Shantiniketan at Tagore's invitation. And then at the Bauhaus itself, they were hosting India's festivals in 1913 in this kind of Orientalist gesture. Dhaka, which became the capital of Bangladesh in 1971, and along with it the absorption of colonial and Pakistan-built infrastructure, was linked to manufacturing industries located in the northern city of Chittagong. By the time of Bangladesh's late independence, the architect Musar al-Islam had been practicing architecture in an urban context rife with divisions following studies in the United States. With an activism forged in the language movement of the 1950s and survived the pogroms of the independence movement of the 1971, Islam had become a progenitor, if not activist, for an architecture that contended with and reinforced a Bangladeshi national identity. Architect and scholar Qazi Ashraf writes, "Modernity for Musar al-Islam was much a returning as a going away. It is a going away from the immediate colonial past and a returning to an essentialist condition free from exclusivist religious ideologies, traumatic inheritances, propagandist symbolism, and pretentious iconography," quote unquote. Amidst these violent struggles, Islam designed and built a number of government research centers, national universities, not only in Dhaka, but across the nation, and he founded a number of aid networks that centered humanist ideals within communal spaces that he believed sought to amplify one's relationship to nature and community within urban domains. So among his earliest urban projects includes this one, the Institute of Fine Arts on the campus of Dhaka University, as well, and this is an extraordinary building. It's his first major building in Dhaka. You can see his use of the jolly screens that I've been talking about. These are terracotta, this free-flowing stair. And in the plan, you can see that the linear nature of the building ends in a series of studio spaces for artists that surrounds a kind of pond. Through their minimal structuring and openness, the structures intimate an exchange of ideas that aligned the production of knowledge with a broader sense of institution building. The use of jolly screens used in these buildings as both spatial and visual organizing elements link the campuses to his later work at Chittagong University, as well as 5 polytechnic institutes across the country designed in collaboration with the American architect Stanley Tigerman. So here is a view from around 2018 of the Dhaka University Library. You enter the library up this beautiful ramp, and then you see the stacks there. And here is 2 views of Chittagong University. On the left is one of Islam's drawings. I'm sorry about the blurriness, but what you're looking at is really extraordinary detailed topography and how these buildings are situated across these topographies. And it was believed that for Islam, that you would have no longer than a 15-minute walk from where you were staying to your classroom, in all places across the campus. And then this is a view of one of those buildings today. Okay. Complementing such interventions, Islam was also examining the role of the rural village in Bangladesh. I think I'll go back to this image here. As an active element in the landscape, for a planning project that he would later build in the Chittagong hill tracts for indigenous settlers there. And he was very much about thinking to design the ways in which rural workers and labor systems could complement a different kind of architecture. Encompassed by the expansive lands dominated by American Louis Kahn's plans for the Jantia Sangshad Bhavan, or the National Capital Complex of Dhaka, a plot was set aside adjacent to the capital for the building of a national library, an archives building, to be designed by Masrul Islam. With Bangladesh becoming a signatory to the non-aligned movement in 1973, so 2 years after liberation, the country was strengthening its economic and foreign policy positions through development strategies that sought to build cultural infrastructure as much as pacificity following the war. Yet Masrul Islam's career at this time soon began to suffer, given that much of his early work was always associated with this notion of an East Pakistan. So Islam is this fascinating figure who's both an activist, a pacifist, and very much engaged in an architecture that sought kind of democratic ideals at a moment when the control of the government was very much engaging in these kind of monumental presencing in the city. And so I'm showing you here one of the 2 buildings that were proposed. On the left is the current National Library. On the right was to be the archives, which was never built. And I like this idea of twin buildings, one for the past and one for the present, that he's designing here. Commissioned by the Ministry of Cultural Affairs in 1976, the proposed cubic volumes of the National Library and Archives establish material, climatic, and spatial capacities that illustrate generative approaches to considering an architecture for a newly independent state. When viewed alongside these university plans, Islam's conception of an architecture of independence is reliant upon a philosophy of collective potential, while exercising a relationship, a very close relationship, to landscape and nature. And last, to Ceylon and Sri Lanka, a transition to alignment. One of the earliest adopters and signatories to the non-aligned movement, as well as being the site for the passage of the Colombo Plan, Ceylon had a succession of governments whose political ideologies alternated between a reinforcement of diffusive regional cooperation and that of isolationist self-dealing. The translation of these attitudes was felt in architectural production early on through phases that roughly parallel the ways in which non-alignment policies extended or countered the industrialization of the country. Alongside India and Pakistan, the British colony of Ceylon was granted independence in 1948 and renamed Sri Lanka to join the Commonwealth in 1972. If the earliest years of Ceylon's independence signify the crafting of foreign policy around these kind of nascent non-alignments, the years from 1956 through the late 60s point to social and political transitions that embrace the potential for tourism and internal development while extending how the environment itself impacted the making of a new architecture. Ceylonese architects such as Minette de Silva, Jeffrey Bawa, Anura Ratnavibhushana, Panini Tenakun, seen here on the screen, and Valentine Gunasekara, all of whom studied architecture outside of the country, benefited from working from a position of what I would call both and, an intimate knowledge of the specificities of place, yet identities allowed for conversations that embraced a more holistic idea and view of Western and Asian discourse. A slow awakening toward economic liberalization through South Asia led to further expansion of industrialized economies, including infrastructures that affected the reception of historical and vernacular architecture. For the 1958 and 1965 National Industrial Exhibitions in Colombo, and subsequently the 1970 Expo Pavilion in Osaka, Japan, designed here by Jeffrey Bawa, with interiors by the designer Ina de Silva, indicated early instances in which Ceylon would press for foreign and local manufacturing and engineers to expand an economy formerly based solely on agriculture. Sponsored by leading manufacturers, including the Ceylon Steel Corporation, itself supported through, again, the Colombo Plan, the early exhibitions, modernist pavilions and displays became insertions of vibrant examples of an architecture that challenged prevalent orders of visual supremacy against a formerly colonial space. And so here in Osaka, you have this very lightweight, almost transparent cube filled with paper lanterns. And the paper lanterns are indicative of Vesak lanterns, kind of Sinhalese idea of New Year. And then these gorgeous batik banners by the designer Ina de Silva, who I will talk about in a moment. For Ceylon, or Sri Lanka, by contrast, the appearance of these elements did not immediately find resolution in architecture's conventional approaches toward visual and spatial hierarchy. Due to austerity measures brought forth as part of the nation's convergence with the non-aligned movement and a turn toward socialist ideals, self-sufficiency in both material and manners of form were paramount. The modern, rather, was broad in scope and local in formation, and demonstrated through the island's long-standing social cultural connectivities. Found among anti-colonial art practices of the early 40s, including those of the Colombo-based 43 group, whose embrace of the landscape and its reductive forms were especially found among the photographs of Lionel Wendt, and the notion of a Ceylonese modern gestures toward a kind of broader understanding of its islandness. And so here are two members of the 43 group. On your left, who's called the father of Sri Lankan modern painting, George Keat, a self-taught artist, and on your right, Lionel Pires, who would go on to live in the UK in the late 90s and early 2000s. And here's the work of Lionel Wendt. Two kind of key images. Lionel Wendt, also a self-taught photographer, working not only with the kind of homoerotic imagery that you see on the left, but also with many double exposures, experiments with solarizing prints, and layering photographs upon photographs. And he died quite young, and finally, after years of trying to gain access to his archive, I was able to do so earlier this year, which was kind of a remarkable kind of discovery. In one of the earliest descriptions of a paradigm for modern architecture on the island of Sri Lanka, architect Minette de Silva writes that her Karunaratna house in Kandy, her first project in Ceylon, was, quote, an attempt to synthesize indigenous traditions with an architecture designed for a contemporary Buddhist Sinhalese family and its ways of living, using whatever materials and means were suitable, both modern and traditional, including those buildings that were found nearby. And this is its current state, often considered the first modernist house on the island. A reclaiming of locality within cultural specificity furthered architects such as Minette and Geoffrey Bawa's forays following periods of study in Western Europe. Their built projects are invested in tectonics that reconfigured how surfaces might be understood as symbol and method. Registered at opposing scales, the reflective surface, seen in drawings and executed materially among built spaces, became both a conceptual and material hallmark of De Silva's and Bawa's synthetic architecture. And when I'm talking about a reflective architecture, this is the label that you see here. It's the Watapalua housing scheme. It was the only large-scale housing scheme that Minette designed. And it was designed to, see this break? It was designed to be an additive housing process. So as you might get more funds and your family got bigger, you could build onto these houses. And we're interviewing a number of the residents who still live in these houses, and they talk about them as kind of these ideal spaces for growth and for expansion. The opening of Ceylon to external economic influences through the hospitality industry strengthened the presence of tourism in establishing a new architecture. Through his earliest projects with the colonial-era office, Edwards, Reed and Begg, Geoffrey Bawa became the principal designer for some of the first hotels on the island, including an unbuilt Hilton Hotel for the American company in 1965. Two projects, however, completed in 1962, by comparison, became the first models of what might be called a regionalist approach for Bawa's thinking about the transitional scales of home and nation from the private domestic realm to that of the hotel. In the Ina de Silva house, here on the screen, sited in the midst of a dense urban quarter in central Colombo, this is Geoffrey Bawa's first house turns inward toward a cultivated courtyard enclosed by timber columns that he brought from southern India. And so on the plans you see on the left, you have to imagine that these are walls, and this house is situated in between two very large-scale urban structures. And it was bought by the artist Ina da Silva because the land was cheap there. And so the house is designed in between these walls, and this is what it looks like today. Graduated internal spaces in the Ina da Silva house open to each other and indicate the ways in which this textile artist imagined and worked as a designer, and who would go on to fabricate monumental entry ceiling textiles, among others, and interior fittings for the Bentota Beach Hotel, the first of several beachside hotels for Bawa's then independent studio. And this is the renovated entrance of the Bentota Beach Hotel, connoting a medieval or colonial coastal fortress, several of which exist along the Sri Lankan coastline. This hotel was built atop an aggregated stone plinth from which a cantilevered concrete frame structure supports upper floors. So in 1962, to imagine a concrete cantilevered structure on the ocean in Sri Lanka, I think is extraordinary. And Ina would collaborate throughout her career with Jeffrey on installations like these, among many others in his houses and other buildings. And this is another view of the entry. So Bawa's drawings and projects oscillate as an imaging of material and the material of image. His projects locate newfound manifestations of transparency across histories of an island's evolving landscape. Among such imperfect yet cultivated grounds from which a deeply ingrained dialectical armature upon which architecture was founded and now moves past. These projects offered Bawa and his associates revelatory modes by which to challenge the intersection of visual and temporal experience. And in conclusion, I'm going to talk about an architecture of becoming. Regional and transnational political alignments attempted to establish a coherent portrait of these disjunctive territories and urban imaginaries through a linking of state and economic actions that exacted the construction of new typologies to validate modernism's promise. Even with schemes that piqued non-alignment or the sharing of resources to induce forms of mutual aid, these countries and regional partnerships were nonetheless aligned through architects and planners. Large-scale government-led development efforts, when viewed through the collaboration of practitioners, craftspeople, laborers, and erstwhile protégés, situated South Asian modernism's linkage of technology and action, material and metaphor, and continually became nuanced. Striving for an architecture rooted in their respective homelands and histories, while embracing protocols from further afield, architects in South Asia pursued building with an unwavering clarity as a way, as architect Balkrishna Doshi describes, to, quote, become again. Even as Bawa's architecture today, for instance, continues to redefine the capaciousness of Sri Lankan and more broadly Asian spaces, such as found in one of his last hotel projects called Kandalama. His projects in particular, produced by an atelier, very small atelier, counter the hypervisibility of monumental buildings that were being deployed throughout the region as media, and instead accelerate narratives of becoming and embody as ever the complex truths of their materialization. In their trapped air and light, we thus disappear. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean, for such a compelling and beautiful and thought-provoking lecture. I would like to welcome Vikram to the stage. Yes. We have really interesting entryway, so Vikram will magically appear from the back alleyway and joining Sean. And while they are preparing to engage in discussion, if you have any questions, hold on to that thought. They will be exchanging some remarks, and we'll be passing around the mic in a few minutes.
No, let's just do the chairs. Do the chairs. Do the chairs. Do the chairs.
We were originally going to sit on the edge of the stage, casual style, but
No, I think this is good.
yeah, okay.
All right. This working? Yes, this is working. Okay, so we have about half an hour, and maybe we'll go 45 minutes, maybe an hour, maybe hour and a half. It's Indian Standard Time or South Asian Standard Time. We'll see how it goes. So, Sean, first of all, thank you. Thank you for a well-crafted, beautiful presentation, both in words and in images. So it's such a
Thank you.
delight to have you here.
That means quite a bit. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
And for the most, and I'm going to sort of monopolize the conversation for the first half, and then for the second half, you should be preparing to ask some amazing questions. And I mostly want to focus on what you began with a little bit with, which is, what is the importance of all this today? That's what I want to really discuss with you. Okay. Yep. Because this is 50s, 60s, 70s. And this is a, post-colonial decolonizing moment. And today, the world is quite different.
Or is it?
Or is it? I mean, maybe we can turn to that question. So, and as you know, a lot of this architecture, you yourself showed, some of it is coming apart of its own. A lot of it is also being demolished. The 50s, 60s is, and not only in South Asia, across the world, including here in Seattle, North America, Europe, Australasia, everywhere, right? Or Japan. I mean, just now the bubble tower in Tokyo was just brought down. But that's very specifically architecturally speaking, again. So, but I want to sort of, ask the question, and you referred to Ukraine. Why is this moment, was it a failure that something should be, recorded to history and perhaps preserved a little bit and been there, done that? Or do you think there is something that this whole period, its politics, ideology, and architecture and aesthetics, has to offer to better understand today?
Thank you for that question, Vikram. When I was starting to work on this project and thinking about why these buildings, why am I drawn to them, what do they signify, not only in the spaces of the city, but then how might they be related to each other or not? What I started to discover is, while they might not be aesthetically linked to each other, ideologically, they're very much undergirding a system of thought or a set of ideas around belonging, around trying to create alliances, not only political and economic, but social alliances. And more broadly, I felt that this was also the diminution or the seeming erasure of boundaries, of borders and boundaries, both intellectual as well as physical. And when we talk about, say, the colonial past and then a post-colonial present, if you will, so much of that has been drawn. So much of it has been designed. So much of it is about that one image of Jinnah and Nehru literally drawing a map, drawing a line on a map and saying, this is yours and this is mine. And as we start to look at that and translate that, it's exactly what's happening today. It's exactly this idea of ownership and occupation and who gets what and how that is increasingly not only dividing people, but also creating these artificial notions of who we are and who we are not. Right. And when we look at, say, non-alignment as an idea, and that first image of all the name cards, I would rather be sometimes in all of those countries because they at that moment, there was such a great hope and potential that their shared allegiances as colonial spaces, once independent, could create different forms of agency and different forms of power from the ground up. Right. And that ground upness is what we are dealing with today, or we're trying to reconcile or reckon with today. We see it in this nation, we see it even in Sri Lanka with the toppling of the former president, that the people, writ large, a population, can come together and say, we don't accept these conventions or conventional power structures that have divided us. Right. And created power vacuums, but also like the imposition of power. So then architecture for me becomes this kind of sensitive medium or filter through which to understand the larger forces that are at play. And it can tell us something about how we as academics or cultural institutions begin to rely on that breaking of boundaries and an understanding of what it meant to be in the global South at that moment.
Right. I mean, I think, you mentioned the production of the term third world. I mean, I think it's important to remember that the third world in Bandung was a term that was set up to say that we are not going to follow the two-world theory, yeah, where it was USA versus USSR in the Cold War, right, but that we are going to make a third world, yeah, which is neither aligned with this side nor that side, but will have its own vision of what a world would be. Yeah. Now, I want to emphasize that word world, yeah, right? That the vision of non-alignment was not just about what the post-colonies would do, but that they were trying to paint the picture of what another world might be beyond the divisions of the Cold War.
Beautiful.
Isn't that true?
Yeah.
And what I'm asking is, the Cold War is over. We won it, or we can that's not the main point here. Yeah. Where are we? I mean, yeah, we have not arrived at a new progressivist vision of another conception of the world. Aren't we still in a sort of a neo-colonial situation?
Absolutely, absolutely, because if you think of, I love this idea also that a third world is one of potential. Mm-hmm. It is one of saying we recognize that the historical markers of those powers that impacted us for centuries, we acknowledge that, but we are not that anymore. The problem, I think, comes then in that the infrastructure, social infrastructures, economies, the afterlives of the colonial are maintained.
Yeah.
They have to be maintained in certain instances. For instance, I think of the railroads in India, right? They're so reliant on railroads for not only commerce,
Right.
but also for communication across a nation. But we're in that same bind now because these nations of the so-called third world or of the global south, that was also the other term that was kind of not invented then, but it was at least thought of.
I mean, the third world has been replaced by global south
Exactly.
as a term, which
Exactly.
is, we can discuss that.
And then the third world, though, had a negative connotation, or still does, right?
It has
it's
a
a
negative
diminishment rather than an actual embrace of a different vision
progressivist vision. Yeah.
Exactly. And I mean, the notion that we are having land acknowledgements in cultural institutions across the country now shows you a kind of turn to, wait a second, we haven't acknowledged, we haven't recognized the ways in which institutions have used land, for instance.
Right.
But if we took that to be on a global scale, we haven't acknowledged or recognized the ways in which these nations actually have contributed and impacted us. It's always the other way around. So the minute that you turn the table, for me at least, and look from the perspective of, say, a Sri Lanka or Ceylon to the other world, your whole perspective changes.
Right.
And it's not about Western Europe anymore. It's not about a modernism or a modernity as defined through or by humanism.
Right.
It is a humanism that is rooted in perhaps Buddhist doctrine, but also 6,000 years of history, and not some kind of document that was written by a bunch of white men, slaveholders, white men, right? And to me, that's a turning point for not only how I started to understand my position in these spaces, but also the ways in which we can learn, in particular, architecture.
Right. Yeah. No, thank you for sort of the further modulation. I mean, I would say, this is what I'm hearing you say, is that, yes, the non-alignment, the third worldist, sort of Nehruvian, Bandungian, Tito Bros, Nasser kind of worldview offered an alternate progressivist vision of the world. And this was not a vision that was simply modernist universalist, nor was it sort of isolationist, we're going to go pre-colonial, ultra-local, which we sort of see versions of in kinds of various neo-nationalisms across the world today, which is proved to be, I would argue, reasonably dangerous.
Absolutely.
So it was an alternate progressivist vision. And in some ways, what I'm hearing you say is that that project of post-colonial project has become the decolonial project, and it is being embodied now globally. So we feel it very important here in Seattle, every event, to recognize the indigenous peoples on whose land we are, sitting and working. And I think the important thing over there is, as in the non-aligned movement, the acknowledgements we do today is not simply a matter of pious, hand-folding. It needs to also be transformed into the recognition, or rather the urgent remindering, that these people who are still around, that the global south or whatever, is a repository of critical aesthetics, knowledges, sciences, arts, and informations, which may be critical for our survival in the future.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because the moment that you turn and say, we're not going to work from an idea of us and them, or I'm going to question this nature of a boundary that is somehow drawn on a map and suddenly changes the way that I perceive myself and someone else. These are constructions.
Yeah.
And to embody, or to embrace, rather, these knowledges is to also diminish oneself in the face of millennia of history, and also to diminish oneself in the relationship one has to nature. So I find it fascinating in most of these buildings that I'm looking at that there was an inherent environmental advocacy and charge.
Without being advertising it as
Without
such.
advertising it, right? Yet in the West, that's all you have to make, environmentally sensitive buildings, fine. But it's all couched in capital, often.
And technology.
And technology. So I'm not trying to equivocate, but I'm also saying that we, as architects, as thinkers, can respond to these knowledges, these narratives in particular, in ways that will change and challenge who we are.
And not just to be challenged, but it seems like the sort of dominant consumer capitalist culture, which has given us a lot, has also brought us to a point where we are looking at existential choices.
Yeah.
I mean, we can't continue like this.
Right.
And if all the rest of the world also starts consuming the way we do here in the United States, it's going to be the end for all of us. Yeah. So we have to look at other ways of living, and indigenous cultures, consumer capitalist cultures, have a long history of knowing how to live reasonably, amicably with the planet.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
the amazing images you ended with,
Yeah.
and Sean was in our seminar day before yesterday or day before yesterday, one of those days, yesterday. He was telling us this amazing story of how you have monkeys coming into your room and how you have bobcats going through the corridors. So, and you can already see this amazing inhabitation of Geoffrey Bawa's hotel by trees. This is success.
Absolutely.
Right? When you can have a life and an architecture and a way of engaging the world which is not hostile to, which doesn't insist on a radical division between human settlement and every other species. Right. Yeah.
I think, the modernist paradigm, the Western modernist paradigm that was taught to myself and is emblematic of many institutions is that technology is a solution.
Yeah.
And we operate in the architectural discipline as a solutions-based discipline. We are going to solve a problem with building. But we all know now that building actually is a problem, right? And so
the way we build.
Right? And so rather than using existing buildings, we tear them down, which destroys their carbon withholding, and we build new ones and so forth. So we keep doing this. In the case of the Kandalama Hotel, which is an extraordinary building, I highly recommend a stay there.
Less than $100 a night.
Less than $100 a night. Is not only, I think, and I show you just this example, that you enter through that last passage that I showed into this space, and you're looking out at a very large lake reservoir, and then a rock fortress that was from the 4th century in the distance. And in a way, what Bawa is doing is on one hand privileging the viewer, and that privilege of being able to see that landscape and be in that landscape, but he's also creating an architecture that is not visible. It's not supposed to be visible anymore. You are in it, but that's it, right? And I've been there many times, and I was telling the students yesterday that you can stand in the shower and have monkeys staring at you through the window with very knowing eyes, and like they're looking at you, and it's almost kind of uncomfortable, right? But beautiful. And Bawa was known to say that the ultimate goal of this hotel, of this building, was that the bears and leopards and monkeys would be the final inhabitants of it, not people. So to think about that kind of return, I think is so powerful, because we keep building and building and building and trying to resolve where ourselves are located, when we should just sometimes just say, okay,
Let's just live with it.
let's just live with it and deal with it in ways that aren't about kind of manifesting forms of capital in order to keep pushing things back. That in and of itself creates more problems as well.
Yeah, I mean, and here in Seattle, and in a lot of contemporary thinking, or certainly in architecture, we are talking very actively about how do we learn to live with natural systems. How do we sort of reintegrate? I mean, we have a great park system designed by the Olmsted brothers here in Seattle, and we are very proud of it. But we need to do so much better. We need to learn to sort of live with our natural ecology over here in a manner that may require a little accommodation, both by the natural systems and what we consider to be our expectations of what a city needs to do. And we have a history of regrading the landscape. We have a history of lowering the waters of our lakes, and all these. But now when we sort of reinvoke our indigenous communities, the Duwamish, the Suquamish, the Samish, and so on and so forth over here, we must remember that it's also to learn from them ways of living in this area. I'm just talking about Seattle since we are here, but it applies to everywhere that may be a little lost to us.
I would also argue that it is easier to live like this in the tropics. So
it's easier to live in the tropics,
it's
period.
easier to live in the tropics, period, like full stop. To occupy these buildings, not only in Bangladesh and then in Pakistan, it's always quite stunning to see where these buildings are today and how they've had to deal with, say, adding air conditioning and glass and enclosure when they were conceived to not have any of those things. And you suddenly realize, like, all of this is additive. All of this is additive, and that additive quality is an indicator of maybe not how far we've come, but how far we are past where we should be, right?
And I'll keep going, but from here onwards, I'm happy to sort of take. I'm trying to make sure. I'm seeing somebody who's trying to put their hand up.
Or I can just show lots of nice pictures.
There we go.
Can you hear me? Okay. So something I was thinking about with what you were talking about, sort of through the whole course of the talk, you started with sort of talking about like the non-aligned and aligned world, and the sort of development of these different ways of thinking in modernism. I think something that sort of came to mind later as you were talking about the paradigm of technology in a lot of like modernist architecture is it made me think about the idea that there's like Western modernism is very envelope driven. It's very much about separation, about sort of like control of environment and sort of disassociation of inside and outside. Whereas these projects are very much about the connection, like they're instead of being driven by separation, they're driven by connection. And maybe that non-aligned world also has that idea of connection as its driving idea. And I just was interested what you thought about that.
No, that's a very provocative comment, because you could argue that the non-aligned world not only is building connectivities that didn't exist prior, right? So colonialism, by and large, was about dividing people and maintaining these contains, or maintaining kind of the container of a colonial space. But by and large, they didn't communicate with each other. When those boundaries start to loosen or even disappear, those connectivities can happen in a very radical way that changes social mores, that changes the ways in which culture is being seen or experienced. And you're right that the modernist project is fundamentally about boundary making and about enclosure. And if you just take the house as a metaphor for the nation and a metaphor for the Western world, it is all bound up in the making of a boundary or a border, right? So when we speak of migrants and refugees and transits across huge spaces of land, I think, and this is not to sidestep your question or observation, but I've always thought of the refugee and the asylum seeker as the ultimate human, because they are the ones that transgress boundaries. They are the ones that transgress the landscape. They are the ones that are finding new forms of collectivity and economic freedom sometimes. And it is the nation that comes in, or the state that comes in and says, you cannot do that, right? And to me, that's the problem. That we are so ingrained in our ways of thinking about politics, of government, of statehood, that it's, you can do this and you can't do this, or you can be here and you can't be here, that these boundaries just compound upon each other. And in these spaces, in particular, and I talk mainly about Sri Lanka, because I've spent more time there, those boundaries don't happen as much. They're happening now because there are these neoliberal forces that are really trying to change the way that the economics of the nation happen. But by and large, the architecture, both vernacular and modern and contemporary, takes away all of that and says that you are cohabiting space with animals, with nature, with the world. And that is liberatory and, for me, I think indicative or illustrative of a very different way of becoming or being in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. So I think so modern architecture begins, in a sense, around mechanical ventilation. By closing buildings off and sealing them up and pumping air through it, that is offered as a vision of progress, in the late 19th century. And this is an idea that has come to haunt us today, because even today, all our best, most progressivist, sustainability thinking is lodged around the impermeability of the building envelope. We are just making that envelope tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter, all in the name of energy efficiency and sustainability. Whereas one could imagine a different world where if you got cold, you just put on an extra sweater, and if you got a little hot, you learn to live with sweat. You know, it's the idea of thermal comfort and the 72 degrees that's pretty much killing us in unfortunate ways. And the path forward is very difficult because we just can't go back to, well, maybe we can go back to this, but we cannot continue the path we are going down. So how do we sort of get somewhere else? So, you know, this sort of experiment that was done in the third world, non-aligned worlds, to try and find another way to live, I think is extremely, the work you presented makes it extremely important.
And it's all embedded in social movements, right? Each of these architects is very much keen to work with, observe, help, assist, respond to, however we want to describe it, the underprivileged or the overlooked. Every single one of them. And to me, now we call that social justice. Like that's like a new thing, right? But it's not a new thing at all. It's that turning of perspective of who is important to architecture as much as what is important to architecture. And I mean, so much of these individuals are learning from the people around them, from the laborers onward, of who also builds architecture. Yeah.
There's another question, I think. Yeah.
Hi, Sean, thank you for the presentation. This is very insightful, very interesting. I was wondering in some of the slides that you showed and some of the buildings that you showed, especially the ones in Bangladesh and Pakistan, the Mazhar al-Islam archives, the university in Karachi, and the Doxiadis plan for Islamabad. A lot of those projects were like big government level, state level projects. And so naturally, you know, when you involve those actors in the act of building, they have their own visions of modernity and modernization that the state wants to represent. And of course, the architects have their own way of bringing that vision into buildings as well. I just wanted to ask, in your opinion, do you think that part of the modernism that did show up in these buildings, that was reflected in these buildings, apart from the architect, did that also come from these other actors that had a part to play in these buildings? Did that come up, if at all?
I put Islam on here because he's such a unique figure, I think, for the region, but also for a story of a kind of a modernism rooted in South Asia. Islam was very much disliked by the government later, even though he was incredibly prolific in his buildings. I mean, I just showed, I think, 2. I mean, he's building across Bangladesh in very profound ways, but mainly about or around institutions. And those institutions are informed partly through non-alignment, but also the government. And what you start to see, in particular with, maybe not this building, but with Chittagong, for instance.
The campus?
Yeah, here. So the university system in Bangladesh is, on one hand, it's being operated from government, some governments, local governments, but also federal government. And on the other, they're very much situated within the places that they are. So the 5 polytechnics that he designs with Tigerman are in those areas where there had never been conventional higher education. So they're bottom-up kind of institutions to challenge or to transform the area. So you can see kind of the arc of his career being buffeted by the changes in the government. So sometimes the government really embraces his work, and other times he is a pariah. All because of that past. So he's very much a language movement activist. He's very much a Bangladeshi nationalist in the best way, and also very much dedicated to the rural poor. And so I think for him to work with the government, for instance, on the National Archives and National Building, he's being kind of nudged into that role via Louis Kahn, because he's working with Louis Kahn at the time as well. So Louis Kahn has a degree of agency to say, this is a person that you need to work with. Now, according to some, Islam also rejects all of that and says, I'm not interested, but realizes actually that he can design and build buildings that are on par with that of a Louis Kahn. And especially, I think, the notion of a national library or a national archive as a repository of knowledge, for him is like the greatest kind of role, because he's designing the repository for that knowledge. And he's not then, yes, he's working for the government, but I think he's also working for the people of the nation in that regard. And I think he's having to negotiate that all the time.
I mean, partly what I'm also hearing in that question, Sean, is that what is the relationship between the nation state and this work? And there was a certain kind of a progressivist vision to the nation state. Even Pakistan, Bangladesh, Turkey, a lot of, so-called Islamic nations, which, I don't know, broad simplification has gone. I mean, the nation state, even in India, certainly in India, but many, many places is now, I would not call it very progressive. So what happened? Did this project fail? So it yielded to what we have today? Or is this still part of the unfolding, the becoming?
The becoming or the unfolding. Right?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, so I was just in India, in Delhi last week, crazily enough. And what you see with Prime Minister Narendra Modi's project of realigning and remaking what's called the Central Vista, which is Lachin's era axis through New Delhi. So they can't get rid of that axis, but they can get rid of the ways in which one experiences and sees the elements along that axis. And you just understand now that the Modi government is using an architecture and an urbanism very much to control and to articulate a vision for the state that it is in control.
Putin is one of his heroes.
And we don't need to go any further with that. But these progressivist movements, these liberation movements, these radical movements in certain ways still exist, but they are becoming diminished because of this idea of control or power or the diminishment of agency, of personal and collective agency. Because that produces a kind of fear or an anxiety among those who wish for control. It's happening in Italy as well, right? So
It's happening
I mean,
here.
it's
Isn't it
happening
happening
here.
at home?
It's
I mean, aren't we part of the same problem?
yeah. And I think we could argue that very bluntly, that it's about money, in part, and that we filter our ideas of our own agency and our own power in society through money or access to it. And on the other hand, these governments, including that in Sri Lanka, have realized that, the previous president's family in the Panama Papers, it's been shown to have taken out $19 billion for themselves. So the extractivist economy is happening by and large at multiple scales, whether it's legitimate or not. And that the extractive nature of taking power away from people, away from collectivity, and away from the ways in which we see the world and see the ways in which we encounter the world is very much part of the agenda. And architecture thus becomes the stage set or the backdrop for all of these interactions to take place. I was reading an article recently that Dubai, for instance, is the center. I'm going to get in trouble. Is the center.
It's being recorded.
Yes,
so
I will be careful. The center for very nefarious activities in the world.
Do you want to
But monetary, right? So, but we build a city on one hand to emulate this progressivist idea of the future, right? This kind of strange idea of the future. And yet it's all built through the extractivist, undermining activities of dark actors. So for me, it starts to challenge. I've always been interested in the ground, how the ground gets situated. How do we own ground? How do we divide ground? How we design ground? If that ground itself is rooted, for lack of a better word, in the oppression of others, then we're just building on the oppression of others. And we'll never be able to kind of truly escape that.
Yeah, and maybe we need new epistemologies. I know you got a great lecture on the Ganges coming up in a few weeks. And related to that is also the work of Dilip Dakuna, who's from Columbia. And he will also be coming late in November to UW, so we should collaborate. Both of whom talking about different agencies, different ways of thinking the world, not as land divided by borders, but in Dilip Dakuna's case of thinking of inhabitation as something that lives in an ocean of wetness. Because we are always in water, just in very different forms. I think there's another question there. Yes.
Good morning. Thank you for a fascinating talk. My name is Ananya, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Washington. And I guess my question is going to take us away a little bit from the exact contents of your talk, but I'd love to hear more about your work with the Dhaka Art Summit. Mm-hmm. And I know Professor Prakash asked you about, has this kind of project failed? But my question, or related question, is how are spaces and places like the Dhaka Art Summit perhaps ones that create alternative worlds and futures? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. No, I've had the great privilege of not only seeing the Dhaka Art Summit, several iterations of it, but also now being a participant in it. So those of you in the audience, the Dhaka Art Summit is, or was prior to the pandemic, a biannual set of art exhibitions that are held in one education building in the center of Dhaka in Bangladesh, and curated by or led by one American-born curator who lives in Dhaka, and in Belgium some of the time. And through her, she invites curators from around the world to work with local and regional artists in particular, and in my case, both artists and architects. And there is generally an overall theme, but then we as curators begin to work on how those themes might reflect our own ways of working with artists and architects. So it's an extraordinary moment because in the space of 8 days in 2020, we had almost 500,000 people pass through this event. It's free, so you have all forms of life coming through white art gallery, like white cube art galleries, more or less, to look at, think about, respond to, and experience art. And the artists are not blue chip artists generally. They are artists that you will never have heard of in many cases, but have become quite well known and highly regarded and collected by institutions. So at the root of this project was through a family, the Samdani family, to basically engage with these audiences in Bangladesh who they knew would be eager to see and to experience art. And so over the years, the themes have changed. The scale of the exhibitions have changed. The number of artists have changed. But the mission remains the same, which is to produce extremely high quality, well done, I hate that set of terms, but you get the picture, extremely well done art exhibitions, but for 500,000 people in 8 days. It's an extraordinary event. And I wish I had images of the last one, but I'll describe what I did for the last summit. So I was interested in Masrur Islam. Of course, I've been looking at his drawings now for quite some time. And so I commissioned 15 artists from around the world, all continents, to make new work that responded to Masrur Islam's drawings and projects. So we invited them to come to Dhaka, to look around, to take up that kind of act, if you will. And what you end up with is these extraordinarily sensitive ideas about the built environment, about how to experience the built environment, but none of it looks architecture. Because I think quite often artists know more about architecture than architects do.
Oh, I agree.
So that kind of request, that commissioning of artists to think about a figure like Masrur Islam, who is not taught in architecture school, especially in mine, was a remarkable. They discovered something, right? They discovered also ideas about Bangladesh. So the summit really tries to center Bangladesh in these conversations because for this next iteration in February, Bangladesh is ground zero for climate change.
Yeah, absolutely.
It will be obliterated by rising tides. It will be obliterated by pollution. It will be obliterated by cyclones, et cetera, et cetera. So what do you do? Do you pretend it doesn't exist?
That's an option.
That's one option. We've been doing that a long time in the West.
Pretty good at it.
Right? But in Bangladesh in particular, and in that region, in West Bengal and in Burma, artists, architects, thinkers, people have responded to that in such kind of powerful ways, akin to what you're talking about, Vikram, about kind of new epistemologies. They're not new. They're just we're learning about them. So, and so for this next iteration, which is that Haley described, which is called Bonna, which is a unique take on a Bangla term. Bonna means flood in Bangla, but it's also the name of a young woman. It's a common name for a young woman. So very interesting idea of language, right? And each of the curators...
The bungalow comes from a Bangla term too.
Yeah?
The bungalow.
Oh, the bungalow, exactly.
Yes, yeah.
Each of us is then responding to this idea of a flood. And in my case, we are also thinking about children, because it's the children of today, the small children of today, who will be most impacted by these climatic changes in the future. And we forget about that in art. It's very nice to go to a gallery and a museum to look at art. We forget about children. And so the heart of my exhibition is that I have asked 1,000 children across Bangladesh to make drawings of what they imagine the future of Bangladesh to look like. And that is that they are the architects then. And then I have commissioned a few artists from the region who are severely impacted by climate change and by floods to kind of reflect on that precarity. Thank you.
Let me tag on a short question. Is it okay if we discuss a little bit more? Yeah. Yeah, because amazing curatorial work in the Bangladesh context, and you get a 500,000 footfall, just like that. But you have curatorial experience here in the United States, significant curatorial experience in museums as well. And the work that you have shown, let me sort of I'm a modernist. All my work is on this similar things, so Sean knows me reasonably well, as do most of you. But let me say, for a museum audience, a lot of this doesn't look quite that sexy as they would like it to, Keeping that one factor in mind. Architecture in general, is a difficult topic for museums. But that's a sort of a side issue. What I want to ask you is, so what are your thoughts on curatorial agency for museums here in the US, particularly, let's say, more local museums like ours over here? How can this kind of agency this kind of work be engaged?
So I'll start with my prehistory as a curator. I worked with a great South Asian and Himalayan art scholar named Pratapaditya Pal when I was a graduate student. And he and I worked on a few exhibitions of Himalayan art in Chicago and Los Angeles and other places. And it was those stories that we were trying to communicate through the artworks, which were predominantly, like the latest of the artworks was the 18th century, where you start to find that the narratives that South Asian art in particular reveal are still very much a part of how we might think about them today. When I started at the Museum of Modern Art in 2015, I didn't necessarily have this ambition to make political or politicized or even agency-driven exhibitions. But I felt that that on one hand, how do you make an exhibition about the now? But an exhibition that once it disappears, it sticks with you. So my very first exhibition, Insecurities, that Haley described, centered on this position of the refugee and shelter. And if the kind of conceit of Western modernism is based around this humanist idea of shelter, a la Logier and the primitive hut, then the refugee actually becomes the 20th, 21st century paradigm of this individual who is moving about at great cost, in the world. And at that time, 2015, I could find no architects, with one exception, actually designing shelter for refugees. And yet, at that time, there were 65 million forcibly displaced individuals in the world. 65 million. That figure today crossed 100 million a month ago. And it will increase. What does that mean for architecture? What does that mean for design? What does that mean for the kind of the capacity for us as humans to engage in helping people, but also responding to people in a productive way? So the exhibition for me then became that mechanism where I wasn't guilt-tripping anyone. That wasn't the intention, although I would see people leave the exhibition in tears, which was not my intention. But it touched something, I think, for many people that we all are complicit in, and which is we overlook so many of these people. They are on the news, they're in the paper, but we don't know who they are, we don't see them, right? We forget. But they speak to us as individuals, moving in the world. That exhibition, oddly enough, I had a trustee, a very, very well-to-do trustee of the museum, come up to me at a dinner and said, "I don't like this exhibition at all. It's bad." And I said, "Did you see it?" And he said, "No, I don't have to see it." And it was because, he finally told me, it was because there was an image of a Palestinian refugee camp, small, on the wall. That was it. And I did it very purposefully, but I didn't call it Palestine. I had the location. It was all very much undercover in a way. But that project for me came out of working with refugees and asylum seekers in Australia, which at the time were also being completely disregarded. And yet architects were building these horrific detention centers on Nauru and Manus Island, across Australia, Christmas Island, all to house people that are not wanted. And when you work in an institution that by and large should be a mirror of society, then we have to put the mirror up to society in a provocative way. And my last exhibition in the museum, Reconstructions, was the very first time in 92 years that the institution at MoMA had ever shown the work of a black architect. Ever. So you can see, right? And that project was not an activist project at all, but I was labeled an activist in a sense. And I said, I'm just kind of surfacing an absence here, but done in a way that actually doesn't hold the individual down, but actually allows for these narratives, these stories to be told. And it was very much about the American city and the legacy of redlining and the legacies of quote-unquote urban renewal, which the museum created in 1962. They did an exhibition on urban renewal, but they never once talk about the people that were forcibly removed.
Renewed.
Exactly, right? So anyway, these projects were not meant to cause problems necessarily, but to
why not?
But they're really to ask questions of who we are, right? And I think for the institution that became a liability. They didn't want to deal with that, and it was very obvious in certain respects. So.
On that point, I think, Sean, thank you once again.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you to both of you. Thank you so much for joining all of us. And Just want to say thank you again to Vikram and Sean for this extensive, really enriching discussion, and for sending us in a spirit of non-aligned movement to traverse our own world. Thank you again. And November, Saturday University will happen November 12th, so please join us for that. Thanks everyone. Have a good Saturday.